So in the last few videos, we've been building up the foundations for web technology. So we've done the basics of HTML and CSS. Then we also introduced Sass, which is basically native CSS just with additions of things like variables, include files, ways to organize the CSS and make it a lot more friendly and dry, if you will, so you're not just repeating values all the time. You've got variables built in and stuff like that. The last piece before we then start really making an actual website is to fix the same issue on HTML. So CSS, we've now got Sass, but on HTML, there's nothing out there, I don't feel, that's the same as the equivalent of Sass for CSS. In terms of, you've got a HTML file that you want to, say the most basic thing is include a header and a footer. The navigation header to a website like this would be the header on this website, say, that stays the same for every page. And then you go to another page and this header stays, always there. And that in natural native HTML is not possible. So to give you a quick example, I just downloaded a random free template online, so I didn't have to make one. You can see you got an index.html file that shows, say, this page with this landed home layout. Then you go to the, say, left sidebar, and it has the same again, landed home layouts. But if you look at the source code to the HTML files, so we open with code, and you can see there is the index page. If we open, say, the left sidebar one, you can see it's all repeated again. So there's the two files. And you can see basically all this header is repeated. They've simply changed the class there on the body. Then all the navigation's repeated. It's a hell of a lot of repeat code. So now say you're working with these files and you change your mind or your design, and you want to re-include, say, a different file here, or the header decides that this option is going to change from option 1, you've now got to go through every single HTML file in your whole static page, so like all of these and potentially way more, and edit those values multiple times and keep them in sync. So a solution to that might be to try and find a technology similar to, like I say, what Sass does for CSS. And there are many out there, but personally I've never used many because as soon as I look at them, instead of being like what Sass is to CSS, where you still write CSS, you simply add the additions to it. Anything that seems to work with HTML completely redoes the language. So you're not really writing HTML and then adding the benefits to it. You're practically writing in a different language, a different syntax, and you don't get a feel for HTML. You also lose the native ability. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of people that will debate that there are technologies out there that do what this software I've now written does. But honestly, I don't think there is. I don't think anything does it simple and clean and keeps the ability of writing HTML and it looking like a HTML file. So in short, what I've done is I've made software completely open source as usual. So you can go to GitHub AngelSix and go to DnaWeb if you want the source code to this entire software. And I've documented it well. And then a link to the website is obviously this website that documents everything. So you can read all this. So what we're going to do is simply work through this this website's guide that I've written visually, so it's nice and easy. And you can get a feel for how it works and what I'm talking about. So to get started, you'd simply click one of these two download buttons. So go for the 64-bit if you have a 64-bit machine. Download and install DnaWeb. That will just go ahead and install a file or a folder in here, DnaWeb, program folders DnaWeb, and the version. And then this is the .NET Core application installed, and here is the exe that gets run. And then the installer adds a path to here, so that we can invoke DnaWeb from anywhere. So that's what the installer does. So you click, you install, and then the website will start with explaining why, and the issue with static HTML, which is what we just spoke about, basically, that you change your header on one page, you need to change it on all the other pages, and blah, blah, blah. And then it says, like, enter DnaWeb. So we'll just jump right into actually using this so you can see what I'm talking about. So if we go to just the examples folder that's on the GitHub source. So if you originally clicked on view on GitHub, say here, and you looked at the examples folder, we're going to work through these folders. So that's where we're going to be. So if we go into includes and outputs, this is the first part of the tutorial. So it gives you the most basic example as what I described first. The first thing you want to do is you'd have a website and it's got at least a header and a footer. So if we open this index, header and footer files, and you'll see I've called them .dhtml instead of just .html. And I'm just opening up with Visual Studio Code. You can open them up with any editor you like. And this you can see is standard HTML. So the header is basically the header of my website, nice and simple. HTML, head, title, body. And the footer is then the closing tag to the body and the HTML. And that's then shareable now between any other pages. And in this index page, we've set 2 outputs, so we can delete those. And all we have to do here is include the header and include the footer. And all we do for that is we put this comment in. So this is a HTML comment. So as I mentioned, the point of the DnaWeb is to keep the HTML valid or as close to valid HTML as possible. So it simply looks normal and you can still double click and view the files. It's native to the language. It doesn't go and create a whole new language. It keeps it very similar. So I decided to use HTML tags, HTML comment tags that simply start and end internally with the @ symbol. And that then jumps into these special values that the DnaWeb engine then processes. So we have an index that basically says include a file called header.dhtml, and then we'll write header, and then we'll include the footer. And now that is the most basic example, and you can see the 3 files here. So in order to generate the HTML from this, you can go to a folder where your files are. So typically it'd be the root of your main project folder that you're working in. It wouldn't be directly here. It could be, say, the examples folder, or an actual folder that you're working in. And then the address bar of the title bar here of Explorer, just type DnaWeb like that, and then press enter. And that'll actually then open up a DnaWeb window. And you can see the output. It's saying that it's found the current folder, which we're in. It's found the configuration here, the default configuration from the installed folder, and with these values. And then the final configuration's worked out that we want to monitor this folder that we're in. We want to generate all the files when we start. And we want to process and close false, which means stay open once it's there. And then it's told us basically the version of DnaWeb. It's told us that it's spun up 3 engines, which we'll get into later. And then you can see here green, it's generated the file footer, index, extra, and header. And that's because I didn't save this here to remove that. So if I then delete the HTML it generated for a minute, and I go back to edit this and save, you'll see that when I save this file, this will generate... Oh, hang on, I've clicked in here. That's right, if you click in the window, if you're doing this and you've got something selected, this window won't update. This will kind of pause. So if I did that and then edit something and save, nothing happens because it thinks you're trying to do something. So you just have to get rid of the selection. So let's do that once more. So in here you can see it's generated, but I've deleted it. Edit the file and save. And you can see it then generates the HTML. And if we open up the HTML, you can see it's got the header file, if you will. Then it's got the index files content. Then it's got the footer. So from these 3, it's combined them and generated a HTML file for us. So as you saw then, the next part of this documentation. So we talk about we had a header, we had a footer, and then we include the 2, and it generates. We then talk about if you want to generate multiple outputs or simply change the name. So we've got an index file, but here we might want to change it to say home and give it a new name. And we do that by doing again a DNA tag, which is just a comment with an @ and ending with the @. And we say output and then we give it a name. And if we save that, we'll see that it generates a home HTML file. And in similar fashion, you can do multiple. You can do 2 outputs and save. And it'll be the same file because we haven't changed anything. But now you've got 2 outputs. So then you could output them to two different locations if you wanted the, this file to generate two certain outputs. Then we'll move on to partial. So you'll have noticed that if we stopped the engine, so just press enter twice, and we run the engine again, DnaWeb, on startup it generates everything, and you can see it's actually generating a header and a footer HTML. Well, that isn't actually what we expect, because the header and the footer really are partial files that includes. We don't want to generate HTML from them. So there's two ways we can do that. And if we just step up and into the partials demo folder, and then we'll open these three, you can see the index is just the same. We've got an output of index. We include the header, we include the footer. Nothing's changed from the last example. But in the footer, we've added this special tag that just has got the word partial, and the same for the header. So now when we start up DnaWeb in this folder, you can see it's only generated the index file. So you can define a partial file that way. You could also remove the partial from, say, the header, and if we run it now, obviously it will generate the header HTML. But if we rename the header to start with an underscore, just like Sass, then it won't generate any output for it. So now we can edit the header, and it won't generate output for the header because it's, it knows it's a partial class, so it won't screw up and generate, the output for the header. Whoops, what have we got here? Include file not found. Oh, the header is an underscore at the minute. So there we go, it's generated the index, but then the header, if you edit, it'll still generate. So it's smart enough that it finds that if you edit the header file, it finds out that index uses it and generates that as well. So I've just added this underscore feature this morning to match how Sass predefines if it's an underscore, it's classed as a partial. Or you can simply add this partial tag inside the file so you don't have to name it with an underscore. So you've got two options. I'll likely end up fixing, so again, to match similar to Sass, I'll remove the requirement to have an underscore in the name, and I'll also remove the requirement to do the extension. So probably in another few days, you won't have to do, you won't have to include the .dhtml or the underscore if the file's got an underscore. Or, if it hasn't anyway, and you just got a normal one, you won't have to have the extension. But for now, obviously you do. So when I update that, you'll see in the documentation on DnaWeb.io, I'll update that with, that valid information. So just clean these back up, get them back to where they were. And that is the partials. Now it gets more fun. So now we want to do, say, some variables. So these are good for things like the links to websites that, again, you don't have to repeat or have randomly in the middle of your HTML. You can now make use of a variable and simply inject it in wherever you want. So in the variables, I've done a single class here. But again, you could quite happily, and you really should, have another class that stores your variables, a variables.dhtml file where this can go. And then you can make use of them throughout your HTML any way you like. So all we've done here in this single file is we've told it to output an index file, index.htm. We've then done these two, which are profiles. So we remove these for the minute, just so it doesn't complicate things. We've then done a special data tag. So we've done, this time, a comment but with a $, which instead of it being a single line command, this $, now means we can break out and do some data. And then again, we've kept the format the same as HTML. So we're using like an XML style structure. So you do this kind of layout, you do data as the main one, and then you define a variable with a name title, and you give it a value, my title. And if we remove all the other bits, you can see that's all we've got. You can even remove the output, so the name just stays default, and you can get down to, this simple. Now if we save, if we run, save that file, and then run DnaWeb in this folder, you can see it's generated a HTML. And if we take a look at that, you can see it's injected my title. So if we split that over so you can see two files, and we now change the variable name, or not the name, the variable's value, to my title is here or something, and save, you can see it generates this HTML output here. So it's a live, update and a value that you can now use anywhere inside your HTML. So all we're doing in order to make use of the variables is anywhere inside of your HTML, if you just put $2, then the name, then $2, that's how you make use of a variable. And you declare one by simply anywhere at all in your code, you open and close this data tag, and then you put your variables inside. So that's the variables section. And again, you can read more about it on the website here, but it's pretty much that simple. There are, I think we get further down to profiles, yeah. So this DNA variables is something new I've added recently. And in short, you can simply do, you could say copy this, and instead of having my title, or you could keep my title, and let's just do $, and then DNA.date, and then a format of how we want the date to come out. And if we save that and take a look at the output, you can see it's now outputted the date. So this would be good for things like, a copyright notice. Like we do copyright AngelSix, and then you just want the year quoting. So you do that. And then you get copyright AngelSix, and it's always the right date. So it's like an auto-generated value. So these are the DNA variables I've added so far. If you want anything else adding, you just simply ask or add it yourself to the source code. So you can make use of them inside of HTML. So one useful thing might be the current project path or the current file path for whatever reason. And then we'll move on to output profiles. So in this file at the start, if I just go backwards, you can see, how to use output, where you generate an output name. You simply give it a name. Now we've got variables. I've decided that, well, it's for a reason, and you'll see why when you get to ASP.NET, as we've now added the ability to have profiles, which is simply a different version of an output. So we generate output for ASP.NET Core, as well as static HTML for, building up the UI flat in the first place. So this can also generate HTML output, ASP.NET CS HTML files. And for that, we make use of these profiles. So if you have a file name, and then you simply end it with a colon and a name, this name is then what's called the profile name. So now it will generate a file called index-server.htm, but anywhere there's a variable made use of inside of your HTML, like here, title, for the outputs with a profile name, it will actually look for a different variable. It will look for a variable that's in the profile server. So you can see here, there's two ways to define variables inside of a profile. One is you can define the variable the normal way and simply add an attribute that says profile equals and give it a name. Or the other is you can make an entire group called profile with a name and then put the variables inside. So if you've got lots of variables and you're doing, say you've got, 10 variables, and they're not all called tile, they could be tile 1 to 10 or something. And then you have one for the server, and you wanted to, do another 10. You'd probably use this group like this, so that you simply define the profile name once, and then you would, add them all inside there. If you were to do it this way, you'd end up with, as you can see, a load of, variables with this repeating itself. So it's completely up to you how you want to make those variables and how you want to define the profile. But you'll see more on an example of what happens here. So again, this is exactly the same as the first example, but we added these two outputs with a colon and then server and server2, which is simply defining two different output profiles. And what should happen is that the server file should pick up on the variables that are in our server profile, which would be this one. So we should say my server title. The server2 should pick up on the profile name server2 that should say my other server title. So if we look at the output here, and we could just dump that over there and see that, and we save, you can see it'll generate the three files. And then if we looked at the 3 files, you could see there's the index.htm with my title. The index server has got the server title, and the index server 2 has got the other one. So by just having one single DHTML file and generating here and having a single variable, you can generate 3 different outputs with 3 different values. So again, you can make use of this however you like in HTML, and all this will become very useful as we make the websites. But that is output profiles. So that's all the output profiles being generated in that way. And again, like I say, they'll be more useful as you see them used as we build the website. So that's this output profiles. Again, the website will give you a read up. In a similar fashion, as well as output profiles, you have input profiles. And again, I mentioned here, the perfect use case for this is ASP.NET CS HTML files. And if you've done ASP.NET development before, you'll know that CS HTML files have a layout tag that simply states for the header, instead of having the header directly in the file, it simply has an include, a layout equals, and you specify a header a different way. So in order to do that, you'd need to have a different, basically you wouldn't want to include a header in the ASP.NET output because it won't have the header, it uses a layout option instead. So you basically want to include a file, but only in a certain profile. So similar to output, where you're outputting, variables, if you will. The profile's still the same. You still define it just the same. You still have colon after the name, and you define a profile, and that will still work for variables. But the difference is, as well as variables, this can work for includes. So only include a header in certain cases. So if we look at the input profiles, and we open all 3 of these in Visual Studio Code again, the header and footer are just the same as normal, and the index is just the same as the first example. The only difference now is we have, if we removed those 2 to see, we have an include header and an include footer, but we've tagged the include header and footer with a wrapped profile name. So now by default, if we were to spin up DnaWeb in this folder, and then we open up the HTML, you can see that there's no header and footer. There's just the index file, because by default, the profile is nothing. So this should only be included if the profile is wrapped. So basically, header and footer never get included. So then we instead define 2 outputs specifically, and we have an index full, which is basically then tagged with the profile wrapped so that both the header and the footer get included. And then we have your standard output, which basically is a normal output. We simply give it a name, and we don't specify a wrapped profile. And then when we save this, we'll now get index content and index full. And as you'd expect, the content is just the content. So this would typically be your ASP.NET page that doesn't want the header and footer. And the index full now includes the header and the footer. And again, this is all being generated from one file. So that's the input profiles. And again, like I say, we'll make use of all of this when we're making the website, but we just want to cover all the features in one. Inline data next, which is where you simply want to include small. The reason I made it was sometimes you just want to include small bits of HTML and not have to create a separate file, just to do that. And again, this was aimed at the ASP.NET situations where you might want to include a layout. So if we go to input data and we open this up, and you'll see here you've got again a simple part of normal HTML here. You've got 2 outputs that will be generated, local and server, and the server will only have any specifics that are in the server profile. So there's no variables, we don't use anything there, but we do this include. So include, and then once you do this way of including, everything between the at and the inline part is simply included. It's just output again. So it's basically the same as doing this. You don't really need to do the include around. You know, it's the inline around it. It's just to show you that you can do that. So this will just always be included in all outputs. Then this inline will only be included in the server code. So this is like doing an include, like we've done in the last one, you know, an input profile. So it's very similar to doing, you know, this include only in this wrapped profile. But instead of including a file, as we mentioned here, you're simply including the actual text right here. So you want this HTML without this having to be a file, because it's just a small snippet of HTML. So the output server should end up with this in all, because there's no profile for that, so it goes in all of them. This for the server. And then the special bang symbol here, the exclamation, is for basically only default. So basically ones that don't have a profile name. So if they have any kind of profile name, don't include them, as opposed to this one, which will always be included no matter what. So again, to see the results of that, we just type DnaWeb, and it will generate the output. You can see we've got the, oh, wrong folder, 1 second. We've navigated in and out of that folder. Let's go to the right folder, 5. So if we then go to DnaWeb, you can see it's generated the local and server files. And you now have the local, which has got header, which was here. It's got this is in all outputs, because it will be, because it's simply an inline with no specifics. This is really, you never really use this. Like I say, it's just there for showing you that that exists. And then you got this as in default outputs only, which is this one with, you know, the bang. And then the server one has got the header. This is in all outputs as we expect, and then this is in server only, because we specified the profile. So that, again, the reason for that is if you've got an include that you want to include only in certain profiles, but you don't want to have to make a file just for a really quick and small include. You know, doing an inline, you don't want always to have, you know, HTML. It's similar in C# where you'd say sort of if profile equals server, you know, output, blah, 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 else, blah, blah, blah. And you wouldn't want to have to then put this little bit of code inside a file. You know, if you were just simply doing a, you know, an output of a few lines, you don't expect that to be a new file. So you can think of it as almost like an if statement, that if the profile for the output is server, then, you know, include this bit at this location. So that's kind of the point of the inline data. Next up is, well, in fact, really, let me just double check on the site. So we go through all inline data. Yeah, so really that is, for the most part, all of what we need right now in DnaWeb. So that does everything I need to make dynamic HTML files nice and easily, and be able to share headers and footers and have variables. So I'm sure as we make the websites with this, we can add more features as we need. But the beauty of it is now, because I've made it and it's open source, and we're going to be making real websites with it, anything that we don't like or anything that we need to add, we can add. And we've got a nice, easy way of, you know, of running this system, if you will, of generating this content. So typically, if this is your actual website folder as you're making it, at the start of your day, you'd simply come to the folder, type DnaWeb, press enter, and you'd leave it running while you're working, and it'll auto-generate everything. So again, one thing I did past this was then to go to C#. So I make use of bridge.net in some projects, which we haven't got to yet, but it's a JavaScript. Well, it's basically you write C# code that generates JavaScript. So you can use the full .NET framework for the most part to write JavaScript. And again, it allows it to make JavaScript maintainable, similar to Sass and DnaWeb. That's the point of it, is to be able to make these web languages, but make them a lot larger and a lot more manageable than using, you know, native JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. So one of the things I wanted to do, and one of the things you might want to do, is we have these variables, such as, say, a classic one would be, say, a website link or an URL to the API on your website, and you would embed that URL in the header of your your site. So you'd have a header here, and you might have in the body, you'd have like a navigation with a home page, an index, and about page, and you'd put that in the HTML. But then you'd also want to make use of that on your ASP.NET core website in the background. So again, what you tend to do is have separate C# code files that then store the variables again. So in order to now share the variables that we define in DnaWeb between not only the CSS, the JavaScript, and the HTML files, we can now make use of those variables inside of our C# code in ASP.NET. And to do that, I simply made a C# engine built into DnaWeb. So now you can define your variables just the same, that can be used in the DnaWeb files, again, just the same. So there's nothing special about this. We made a group so that it would add a region around it. And we add comments like this so that they get commented in the C# code. But in essence, this is still just the data tag with a variable in there, and we can make use of this SumID variable inside of anywhere we like. And then we can now output a code file. So if we go to C# and open this DnaCS file, and we just run DnaWeb here, you see it's generated index.cs. So what we have here is because the extension is DnaCS and not DHTML, the engine knows that, this DnaWeb knows it's a C# file, because we've got a HTML engine, which is what we've just been using. We've got the C# engine here, and it's listening out for .dnacs file changes. So we've made a bunch of variables here, and then you can see below now we're writing native C#. So this is just normal C#. And again, to keep it just like a normal code file, we then use this comment here, but this time with a hash, because C#. So I kind of made a hash there instead of it being an @ and this time it's a special value called properties, which is basically a group of variables, and we expect it to be the group DOM-IDs. So what this will do now, where it finds this, it will remove this, and it will replace it with all the variables it finds that are inside a group called DOM-IDs. So we have a group here that we've named DOM-IDs, and then inside of here we've now got variables. We've got comment for data1 here above the variable, called my string1. We give it a type, so we've got a C# type of string, and we want it to have a value of value1. There's another example of a multi-line comment, and then there's a final one below. And you can see then, if we just look at the output, you can see it's generated the C# file for us. So if we look at the native file here, if you will, you've got the namespace, you've got a comment, and then you've simply got inside the class nothing, you've got the special tag. So you've ended up with all the code here and here, and then the special tag has been replaced with a region that's been given the name DOM-IDs, which is the name of the group. And then for each variable it found in that group, it's created a correct public property of the correct type with the value, and it's also added the comment that was in. And then we've got all the the comment in here. And then you can see here, if we were to do a multi-line comment, it's maintaining the spacing. So what we're trying to show here is, even though we've got all this spacing here, it knows, because the way that the comment looks, it's correctly analyzed it and removed this bunch of pre-amount of space here, but while still maintaining any sort of inner space, if you will. So this we'll touch on later, but I just wanted to brief over the fact that you can also generate C# files, and really the only use of that right now is to share variables. So it's simply to generate a C# file that would potentially contain a class with all of your variables in, so that you can make use of that inside your ASP.NET code. So again, that'll probably go a lot further. And then finally, I also embedded Sass. So as you saw in the last video, in order to generate Sass files, you have to run Sass from the command line, or you have to install a tool that are most likely paid for tools half the time. So if we had a Sass file here, we've got a bunch of Sass files. So if we just open them here, you can see a test that imports A, that imports B, that imports C. So we generate basically just a normal Sass file. Now what you'd have to do is go to this folder, type cmd, and then you'd have to type Sass, what is it, Sass --watch dot, I think. And there we go, and then it generates your cache folder, and it also generates the CSS and the CSS map. But the problem here is, and this is what you find with these web technologies, is that then you just working with your code, you start having to think, well, now I've got to run DnaWeb, and I've also got to run this Sass engine, or I've got to find software that can handle Sass processing. And then what about when we use JavaScript or something else? And you end up finding that in the morning when you start work, you need to then open up 3 or 4 different applications to basically just process these files. And that's kind of what I also don't like. And then some of those programs will only work on Windows, others will only work on Mac. Some of them and most of them are paid for. All those kind of issues. So in DnaWeb, again, recently, a few days ago, I added support for Sass built in. So now, if you've got Sass files and DNA HTML files and C# files, all you have to do is run DnaWeb, and this thing will monitor and generate, everything for you. So you don't have to, run your Sass engine as well. So if we looked at this DNA config file, you'll see here that I've specified a path as well called CSS, so that you can change the output of the CSS generated file. So that's another thing that it has, and you can see when I edit the file, it's generated this test.cs because we told it to generate it in a folder called CSS, and then you can open that and it's valid CSS. So it's really that simple. As you simply run DnaWeb, and it will, generate the Sass files for you as well. So now when we're working on our website, we can just run DnaWeb and not have to worry about running anything else. We can then go and write our Sass, we can write our DHTML files, and it will all get generated automatically. And we don't have to go and set up and add folders or anything like that. We just simply browse to the folder we want, like say this examples folder. We want to generate everything here in the morning. We just type DnaWeb here, and it will open up and generate everything. And you can see also if you've got an error, because we were messing around with renaming things, it will highlight it really obviously. So it's saying that it's failed to process index.html, DHTML, because it can't find header underscore header, and that's because we renamed it back. So if we then rename it backwards and we save this file, you can see it then generates. So it's just a really useful way of generating, of writing your HTML files, but then instead of it becoming, I'll write my HTML files for making the initial, dummy website, if you will, and then when we move on to ASP.NET, you end up writing CS/HTML, and you're cutting and pasting the header from this file and the footer from this file, and then moving it over, and then you start tweaking the live website. You end up with a disconjoint between your original created static HTML and what ends up being your live site. That's what always happens. You lose that link between the original files that you were playing with to make the site in the first place. So this always maintains a link. So these files that you write for initially your static website, if you will be the exact same files that will generate your ASP.NET or other language files without losing that link. And again, you gain all those benefits of being able to use variables like you do in Sass, being able to do anything we really want, because I can update this code as is needed. But this is DnaWeb. There's the website DnaWeb.io, and there's a whole write-up of all options that you can do, how it works. But I thought just a video gets people into it first, gets them seeing exactly what it is, how it's done. And then we'll now go ahead and actually make a website using this, so you'll get a lot more feel for it. But I'll be really interested to see and and hear the feedback you have on this, because right now we only use it internal to the people that work for me. So it'd be nice to get some feedback from other users that start using this, and if it's benefited you, and if you've got any kind of feedback. So hopefully this has explained what DnaWeb is, and we'll now start using it in the very next video. So you just let me know what you feel, if you get confused by it, or if you think it's cool, or just anything really. So I'm eager to see any feedback on this. So let me know.